Psalm 5, a morning prayer of David, is a heartfelt plea to the Almighty for guidance, justice, and protection. In this psalm, David rises early to speak with God, his voice the first sound of the day, much like the cry of a child calling to their father in the stillness of dawn. His words are not routine but earnest, born of a soul that knows both the joy of divine presence and the sting of wicked opposition. It is not merely a prayer, but a declaration of allegiance, a soldier reporting for duty at the break of day, his sword sheathed in faith, his eyes set on righteousness. Imagine a weary traveler lost in a forest at night, surrounded by shadows that whisper deceit. David's words are like the first rays of morning breaking through dense fog, offering clarity and direction. He says, "In the morning, Lord, you hear my voice." This is not just a poetic line, it is a lived reality. The early hours are sacred. They belong not to chaos, but to the Creator. The discipline of meeting God before the world awakens is like sharpening your tools before the day's labor begins. There was once an old shepherd in the hills of Judea who would rise with the stars, still visible, kneel by a rock, and whisper the Psalms. It was said his sheep never strayed, for the one who prays before he leads rarely loses his way. David contrasts the righteous and the wicked in stark, vivid lines. He speaks of God's hatred for deceitful and bloodthirsty men, not because God is cruel, but because he is holy, just, and pure. This might sound harsh to modern ears, but consider the ancient gates of Jerusalem. Guards did not admit just anyone. They looked for loyalty, truth, and peace. Just so, the Lord does not welcome evil into his presence. Once, a merchant tried to enter the temple courts with dishonest scales hidden in his cloak. He was turned away, not by priests, but by his own conscience, pierced by the words of this psalm which echoed in the temple songs. You destroy those who speak lies. Yet, amid these stern warnings is a haven of hope. David says, "But I, by your great mercy, will come into your house." This is grace. It is not by merit, but mercy, that David enters God's presence. Like a beggar invited to dine with the king, he walks in not proud, but humbled. There is a story told of a leper healed by Elisha, who returned to the city gates each day, bowing low, not from habit, but from awe that he had been made whole. That is David's posture, one of reverent wonder. He does not demand access. He is grateful to be received. David's prayer for guidance is not passive. He asks, "Make your way straight before me." He is ready to walk, to act, to follow. Picture a soldier on a battlefield with a map clutched in hand, but no light to see it by. That soldier cries out, not for the path to change, but for the lamp to illuminate it. David wants clarity, not comfort. And the Lord, who delights in upright paths, is the guide that does not fail. In the days of the Exodus, the Israelites followed a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. God's path was always lit. This is the kind of direction David seeks, visible, dependable, divine, that the enemies described are not just physical foes, but symbols of deeper evils: flattery, malice, pride. Their throats are open graves, David says, and their speech leads to ruin. Once, a wise elder in the village warned children never to follow the sweet-voiced stranger on festival days, for behind charm could lie great danger. Words are powerful, and David knows this. He does not ask God merely to silence his enemies, but to bring justice. He trusts that falsehood cannot thrive forever under heaven's gaze. Amid all these cries for justice is a refrain of joy. David proclaims that those who take refuge in God will sing for joy, not just survive, but sing. In the middle of a world filled with lies and loss, the righteous have a reason to rejoice. Think of Paul and Silas in the prison at midnight, their chains clinking in rhythm with their songs. Joy rooted in God is unshakable. David, though often hunted and hated, found melodies in his soul because he knew who held his life. The final words of Psalm 5 are a declaration of divine favor. Surely, Lord, you bless the righteous. You surround them with your favor as with a shield. What a picture, a shield, not of iron, but of divine favor. In ancient times, kings had bodyguards, but God's people have something better: the shield of his pleasure. A young boy once carved a wooden shield for his younger brother, painting it with stars and calling it the shield of heaven. Every time his brother wore it, he said he was brave enough to fight giants. Such is the courage that comes when one knows God's favor is near. Psalm 5 is not only a morning prayer, it is a daily anthem for those navigating a world where truth is rare and opposition is strong. It teaches us to begin the day with God, to trust his justice, to walk in his mercy, and to rejoice in his protection. It is a reminder that prayer is not a ritual, but a lifeline. David's psalm echoes down the ages, a trumpet call to all who would seek God's face at dawn and walk in his light. Psalm 5 continues to ring with a holy intensity that refuses to fade with the turning of pages or centuries. It is not just a morning song, it is a battle cry whispered between breaths, a sanctuary for the soul in a world that often forgets how to be still. David wasn't composing poetry for the sake of beauty. He was breathing out survival, clinging to God in the silence before chaos. It is in this psalm that we find the sacred rhythm of seeking, hearing, and trusting, 3 steps in the divine dance of faith. Imagine David not as a king robed in luxury, but as a fugitive hiding in the caves of Adullam. His harp rests on the cave wall. His eyes scan the darkness, but his voice rises in prayer. The words of Psalm 5 weren't forged in comfort, but carved from exile. His enemies were real Saul's soldiers, perhaps feet away, yet he speaks not first of fear, but of worship. In the morning, I lay my request before you and wait expectantly, anxiously. That kind of confidence is not born overnight. It is the fruit of walking with God. Through 1,000 storms, there's something deeply personal about David's plea when he says, You are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness. He's not giving a theology lecture. He's appealing to the character of a father he knows intimately. It's like a child crying out, "I know my dad wouldn't let this happen unless there was a purpose." In a small Galilean village, a woman once lost everything to a dishonest magistrate. Every day, she sat by the city gate, repeating one line. From this psalm, her quiet voice shook the heart of a young judge in training. Years later, he became a man of justice because of her daily whisper of truth. Evil does not dwell with God. David doesn't mask his emotions. He names deceit, bloodshed, and flattery. His words are raw and unfiltered, like the prophets who would come after him. There is power in that honesty. Today, we often hide our cries behind polite prayers, but David reminds us that God can handle our frustration. A missionary once scribbled Psalm 5 in the margins of a weathered notebook while stranded during a civil war. Their throat is an open grave, he underlined, having just been betrayed by a local official. And yet, he closed the page with a note, "But still, I will enter his house in reverent fear." The reverence David speaks of isn't timid. It's the awe of someone who knows they've been welcomed into the throne room. Imagine a courtroom packed with enemies, and yet the judge not only knows your name, he stands to greet you. That's what David feels. By your great mercy, I will come into your house. Mercy is the only key that opens those doors, not merit, not pedigree, just mercy. A child once stole bread from a market in Bethlehem. When the shopkeeper caught him, the boy wept and quoted this psalm, asking to be judged by mercy, not by law. The man dropped the bread and lifted the boy instead. David asks God to make the path straight, not smooth, not short, but straight. That's a profound request. He's not asking for escape, but for direction. He wants his steps aligned with God's will, like tracks that guide a train through treacherous terrain. There's an old tale of a blind man who memorized the shape of the village by touch. One day, the streets were rearranged, but he still found his way. When asked how, he replied, "I followed the straight voice of my God." That's David's heart, a man navigating shadows with divine clarity. The imagery David uses for the wicked is haunting. Their throat is an open grave. It's not just poetic, it's prophetic. Words that seem sweet can carry death. We see this in history's tyrants, whose speeches stirred nations but buried truth. There's a warning here for all of us. What comes from our mouths is a reflection of our hearts. A scribe in the temple once spent a year copying Psalm 5 by hand, pausing every time he reached this line to confess the harsh words he'd spoken that week. His manuscript became a journal of repentance, not just scripture, but as always, with David, justice and joy walk hand in hand. Let all who take refuge in you be glad. This joy is not superficial. It's forged in adversity. It's the laughter that erupts even in prison cells, the dance of feet still chained. There's a story of an underground church where believers sang this psalm in whispers while bombs fell above. When asked why they chose Psalm 5, they said, "Because joy is our rebellion." David understood this. Joy was how he fought back. Spread your protection over them. David prays. The Hebrew word used here paints the picture of wings stretched wide like a mother eagle covering her young. In the wilderness, David had seen such scenes and knew that God's protection was not distant, was near, intimate, fierce. Once, a boy lost in the Negev desert was found huddled under a rock formation, quoting, "You surround them with favor like a shield." He said he saw a shadow like wings cover him from the sun. Whether it was imagination or miracle, he survived. The heat. David ends with a final crescendo. Surely, Lord, you bless the righteous. It's a confident declaration, not a question. He knows that those who walk with God are never truly alone, even if surrounded. Like a candle lit in a storm, the righteous might flicker, but they do not go out. There's an old sailor's hymn, inspired by this verse, sung when storms rose at sea. Shield us, O Lord, with your favor so wide, for even the waves must bow to your side. That's the spirit of Psalm 5. It doesn't deny the storm, but it exalts the shelter. David's prayer is also a challenge. It invites us to examine whose voices we trust, whose company we keep, and whose path we walk. Are we standing at the gates of God's house, or seated at the table of scoffers? The psalm makes no room for half-hearted allegiance. Once, a prince of Judah abandoned his courtly life to join a group of temple musicians after reading this psalm. He said, "I'd rather sing before God in the morning than feast before men at night." Such is the magnetic pull of holy devotion. And what of waiting? David waits expectantly. That word holds weight. It means believing the answer will come, not might, but will. It's the posture of the watchman on the walls, peering into the dark with unwavering faith that dawn will break. There's a beautiful scene in an old rabbinic tale where a young girl places a chair beside her bed for God to sit in while she prays Psalm 5. "I wait for him to answer," she said, "so I leave him a seat." That's faith with imagination and trust woven together. Psalm 5 is not just David's voice. It is a call to every believer who has ever stood between danger and deliverance. It's for the early riser who meets God before the rush. It's for the weary soul who needs justice. It's for the joyful heart that sings despite sorrow. In every verse, we find not just poetry, but promises. It reminds us that God is attentive, holy, merciful, and just forever, a refuge and a righteous judge in the end. Psalm 5 teaches us how to pray with honesty and hope, how to trust in a God who listens, leads, and shields. It is a morning melody for every soul that dares to believe that God sees, God hears, and God answers. David didn't write this psalm to be analyzed. He wrote it to be lived. So may we rise like him with voices lifted before the sun and walk through our days, shielded by favor, guided by grace, and surrounded by songs. Certainly, here are 20 more original and immersive paragraphs meditating on Psalm 5, layered with biblical tone, stories, examples, and diverse expressions to deepen the texture and bring the psalm to life. There is a sacred rhythm to Psalm 5, an unseen cadence that pulls the heart toward heaven even when the feet are heavy with earth's burdens. David's voice isn't just his own. It becomes the echo of every heart that has ever longed for justice and refuge in a world gone crooked. Give ear to my words, O Lord. Consider my meditation. This is more than a request, it is a soul, unraveling at the feet of its maker. It is the language of vulnerability, as if the psalmist has laid bare his soul like parchment, hoping the ink of heaven will rewrite the sorrow with mercy. Picture a field before sunrise, the mist curling low, the dew heavy on the grass. That stillness is where David's prayer lives. It is not hurried or loud, he says. In the morning I will direct my prayer unto thee, and will look up. What a simple but profound act. A man once found himself trapped beneath the rubble of a collapsed house during an earthquake. For hours, he could do nothing but stare upward through a crack of light. He whispered Psalm 5 again and again, choosing to look up even while pinned down. When rescuers pulled him out, his voice was nearly gone, but his first words were, "He heard me." David's boldness is striking. He does not come crawling in self-doubt, but stands on the foundation of God's character. He knows whom he is, addressing, "For you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness." He isn't flattering God, he's aligning his petition with divine truth. It's like a servant knocking at the door, not because he's confident in himself, but because he knows the goodness of the one inside. There was a widow in Zarephath who once prayed like this during famine, confessing God's justice even while her cupboard sat empty. That is faith, with its teeth gritted and its eyes on heaven. The psalm cuts sharply when David turns his gaze to the wicked. Their throats are graves, their speech corrupt. These are not just sinners in the casual sense. These are people who've made deception their profession. It's unsettling, but necessary. Truth and love cannot live where lies are allowed to nest. Like a doctor naming the disease before offering the cure, David lays bare the corruption that must be judged. In a small synagogue in Babylon, there was once a ritual of reading this psalm before business contracts were signed. It reminded all that dishonest scales and false tongues had no blessing. Then, like a river turning sharply, David steps into the sanctuary of mercy. But as for me, I will come into your house in the multitude of your mercy. This is where the psalm begins to glow. David does not claim righteousness as a right, but as a gift. Mercy opens the door. A thief on the cross would one day echo this cry, not boasting in deeds, but asking to be remembered. Jesus answered with the same mercy that David knew. Today, you will be with me in paradise. The door was still open, still dripping with grace. David's desire for a straight path is the cry of a man who knows the dangers of his own heart. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness, because of my enemies. Make your way straight before my face. It is a humble cry for guidance. Once, a boy traveling alone through the hill country carved Psalm 5 into a walking stick. He said it was to help him choose the right forks in the road. Every time he paused at a path, he would grip the stick and pray, "Make it straight, Lord." The stick was later found in a shepherd's hut, worn but whole, just like the boy's journey. It is not only outward enemies David fears. He knows the danger of flattering lips, of charm without character. There is no faithfulness in their mouth. Their tongue is deceitful. Words are not harmless, they are arrows, seeds, and fire. A man once built a great temple, but used bribes to do it. Years later, it stood abandoned, birds nesting in its cracks. People said the stones were heavy with lies. This is the fruit of words, not born from truth. David knew such people. He had dined with them, been betrayed by them, and still chose to trust in God's justice over personal vengeance. Destroy them, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. These are hard words, imprecatory words, but they are not born of hatred. They are born of a longing for justice. David does not take revenge into his own hands. He lays it at the feet of the righteous judge, like Abigail stopping David on the road to Nabal's house. This psalm shows us that divine justice is better than personal retaliation. Let the wicked fall by their own schemes, not by our hands. Let them be caught in the nets they set for others. And then, like dawn after a long night, joy erupts in verse 11. But let all those that put their trust in thee rejoice. This is the breath of heaven rushing into tired lungs. Trust becomes the gateway to joy. There's a hidden promise here: those who run to God will not only be safe, they will be glad. In the slums of Calcutta, a group of children once sang this verse with tambourines made of tin lids. Their joy was not in circumstances, but in refuge. They believed they were shielded, and their laughter was louder than their lack. David pictures God covering his people as with a shield, not a flimsy barrier, but a full-body protection, thick and glorious. The Hebrew word suggests a rapinga, complete encircling presence. Think of the Red Sea walls surrounding Israel as they walked through on dry land. That is the image. Danger on every side, but God's favor, thicker than water, stronger than stone. Once, a missionary in hostile territory prayed Psalm 5 every morning over his children. He believed the shield of favor was not poetic, it was real, invisible, and ironclad. Psalm 5 reminds us that prayer is not passive. It is not a wish tossed into the wind, but a strategic move in the spiritual battlefield. David's words are military in tone, intentional, directed, expectant. He doesn't mumble. He lays out his prayer like an offering arranged on the altar. In a monastery tucked into the cliffs of Syria, monks recite this psalm before sunrise, each word spoken as if part of a holy blueprint for the day. They believe what David believed. Prayer sets the course. The wicked do not disappear just because we trust God. David knew this well. Saul's spear still flew. Betrayers still schemed. But faith does not wait for circumstances to align it. Acts in defiance of fear. There was a young believer in Corinth who quoted Psalm 5 every time he entered the marketplace, praying not to be lured by dishonest trade. His peers mocked him, but his business thrived not because of cunning, but because of character. David's psalm is also a map for us. It shows how to approach God with reverence, honesty, and hope, not with polished speeches, but with true hearts. God doesn't demand perfect grammar. He listens for sincerity. A man with no education once scribbled Psalm 5 on a scrap of cloth and tied it to his wrist during a long desert journey. He couldn't read all of it, but he remembered the words, "Look up." That was enough to carry him. Psalm 5 reminds us that our God hears. He is not deaf to injustice or blind to sorrow. He listens in the morning stillness, in the noise of battle, in the silence of betrayal. Like a shepherd who knows every bleat of his sheep, God hears every whispered prayer. A girl once prayed this psalm every day for a lost father. 10 years passed, but she never stopped. One day he returned, scarred, silent, but safe. She said only one thing: "He heard me." This psalm is for the weary leader, the betrayed friend, the hopeful child, the righteous remnant. It is a lantern in the dark and a horn on the wall. It reminds us that God is not merely a refuge, He is the delight of the righteous. The ones who take shelter in Him don't just survive, they sing. Their songs rise above the chaos like incense, a fragrant defiance to despair. David's confidence in God's justice gives his heart peace. He knows that evil will not win, that lies will not last. This is not naive hope, it is tested trust. He has seen God rescue him from lions, spears, armies. He knows that divine justice may tarry, but it never fails. A dying king once requested Psalm 5b read at his bedside, saying, "It comforts me that truth still has a throne." Finally, Psalm 5 offers us a glimpse of worship as warfare. The psalmist doesn't fight with swords, but with songs. He doesn't retaliate with fists, but with faith. He prays not to escape difficulty, but to meet it with God. A woman imprisoned for her faith in Eastern Europe sang Psalm 5 aloud each morning in her cell. It became her anthem, her protest, her victory. And so, David teaches us to rise early and look up to, direct our prayers with precision, to trust in mercy, to walk in righteousness, and to rejoice in refuge. The psalm begins with a cry, but ends with a covering. It is a morning prayer, but its strength stretches. Absolutely. Here are 20 more rich and original paragraphs expanding on Psalm 5, full of biblical tone, vivid imagery, stories, spiritual depth, and expressive style, continuing in the same rhythm and texture as before. Psalm 5 opens the gates to an ancient kind of prayer, one not shaped by convenience or comfort, but by covenant. David stands not as a mere man before a deity, but as a beloved son before his Father. "Hear my words, O Lord," he says, but also, "consider my groaning." The Hebrew word here suggests an unspoken sigh, a heart too weary to form syllables. It reminds us that God hears not only our words, but our wounds. There once lived a mute prophet in the northern hills, unable to speak, yet every morning he sat on his knees, whispering Psalm 5 with his tears. Those who watched said the silence was louder than any sermon. David says, "O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice." There's a sacred urgency here, as if he cannot begin the day without this meeting. For David, the sunrise was God's call to action. The dew was his congregation, the birds his choir. There's a story of an elderly woman in Jerusalem who rose at the cock's crow every day, washed her face, lit a candle, and read Psalm 5 before even greeting her family. "No word should be spoken to men," she'd say, "before I've spoken with God." We are told in this psalm that God does not take pleasure in wickedness, nor shall evil dwell with him. This line is like thunder rolling through the soul. It shakes off compromise and wakes us to holiness. In the time of the judges, there lived a man who tried to serve two masters, offering sacrifices in the temple and bribes in the market. He died bankrupt, not in coin, but in conscience. His sons, ashamed, read Psalm 5 over his grave. "Fools shall not stand in your sight." And from that day, they walked upright. David knows the nature of wickedness, boastful, deceitful, bloody. He has seen their camps, heard their lies, tasted their betrayal, but he also knows their end. "You shall destroy them." This is not vengeance, speaking it is prophecy. Like Pharaoh's chariots swallowed by the Red Sea, wickedness has always been swallowed by God's justice in time. A young boy once painted the verse, "You hate all workers of iniquity," on a wall in his village to remind himself that popularity with men is no prize if it earns the displeasure of God. But what hope is there for sinners? If God is so holy, the answer arrives like a cool wind across dry land. But as for me, I will come into your house through the abundance of your mercy. Not because David is better, but because God is merciful. A prisoner in Rome once copied this verse, parchment, and passed it under the jail door to a guard who doubted his own salvation. "This is how I enter," the man wrote. "So can you." David approaches with reverent fear. There's no arrogance here, no flippant prayer. He bows toward God's holy temple. Reverence is the soul's posture when it truly sees the majesty of God. In an old monastery in Ethiopia, monks crawl on their knees the last 100 steps to the altar, reciting Psalm 5 in whisper, not as ritual, but as reverence. They say, "We bow low here because mercy lifted us high." Then comes the plea for leadership. "Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness." David knows his own steps are unsteady. His path is crowded by enemies. His heart is vulnerable. He does not ask to be led by instinct, culture, or emotion, but by God's righteousness. A blind shepherd once taught his sons to sing this verse before guiding sheep across mountain paths. "We cannot see," he'd say, "but the Lord leads straight." David speaks again of the wicked. Their inward part is destruction. Their throat is an open tomb. These are not casual insults. They are surgical revelations. The problem is not outside of them, but within. A teacher once held a clay pot filled with ashes while reading this verse, breaking it mid-sermon to reveal the soot within. So are men who look clean but breathe corruption, he warned. His words lingered long after the pot shattered. Hold them guilty, O God. David isn't hungry for revenges, thirsty for justice. He doesn't desire punishment for satisfaction, but accountability for righteousness' sake. A judge in a Jewish court refused to take bribes his entire life. When asked why, he said, "Because Psalm 5 says God destroys those who lie. I'd rather lose gold than lose God's favor. Let them fall by their own counsels." Wickedness is often self-destructive. It digs pits and falls in them. David knows this. He's seen advisors turn on their kings, friends poison their friendships. In an eastern city, a corrupt official once rewrote this psalm to remove the judgment. Verses, his parchment was found decades later, mildewed, crumbling, unread. The truth does not vanish with edits. It stands, but oh, the joy that follows, the heavy truth. Let all those who put their trust in you rejoice. Trust and joy are sisters. They walk hand in hand. They laugh together, even in sorrow. A woman who lost her child in childbirth sang this verse every Sabbath at the synagogue for years. "My joy is not gone," she'd say. "It's just deeper now." David calls for singing shouts of joy, not whispering, not muttering, Faith is not always quiet. Sometimes it roars. They danced barefoot on temple stones, singing, "You defend us, Lord." And neighbors who heard them wept, "You bless the righteous." What a declaration! Not might, not sometimes, but you bless. This is David's certainty. He has tasted the blessing in caves, in palaces, in fields. Blessing is not always wealthied, is presence. A homeless man in the once painted Psalm 5:12 on his cart and said, "I have favor. I may not have money, but I have the king's shield." David says God surrounds the righteous with favor like a shield. Not behind or beside, but surrounds. A shield that covers from all sides. This is divine defense. A soldier in Jerusalem once took an arrow to the chest and survived because of a scroll of Psalm 5 tucked beneath his armor. He said later, "The psalm shielded more than my body." David's confidence is not arrogance, it's assurance rooted in experience. He has been delivered too many times to doubt. His trust is not theory, it's history. A grandmother once taught her grandchildren to recite Psalm 5 before exams, before travel, before meals. They thought it was superstition, but after her death, they found her journal filled with miracles that happened each time she prayed it. Psalm 5 has become a spiritual blueprint for many. It begins with prayer, confronts evil, rests in mercy, pleads for guidance, and ends in worship. It reflects the whole journey of a faithful heart. From the moment the lips part to cry out, to the final breath of praise, the psalm holds the believer. Like a lit path in a dark world, it is also a call to spiritual discipline. David rises early not by accident, but by choice. Morning prayer is not just beautiful, it's essential. The first fruits of our attention belong to God. In an old church in Antioch, bells still ring at dawn to remind the faithful of Psalm 5. If David sang, the priest says, then so shall we. Lastly, Psalm 5 leaves us with a question. Do we trust God enough to wait expectantly? David doesn't pray and walk away. He prays and looks up. Waiting with expectation is the posture of faith. A farmer plants seed, but it is the one who waits in hope that sees the harvest. So too, our prayers must be sown, watered with trust, and harvested with patience. Thus the psalm ends not with silence, but with a shield of favor, a song of trust, and a voice still lifted in the morning light. David teaches us not only how to speak to God, but how to stand in His presence. May our mornings echo with this psalm, and may our lives be wrapped in the shield of His mercy forever. The first rays of Psalm 5 shine brightest in the darkest seasons. David did not write this prayer in a time of peace, but when the world around him was soaked with opposition. His enemies weren't only outside the gates, they had once dined at his table, and so his words rise like incense, not from comfort, but from crisis. A prophet once said, "The purest prayers are forged in the fire." And indeed, David's prayer carries the smoke and scent of affliction turned to worship. The opening verse is a plea, "Give ear to my words, O Lord." But it's not only about what is said aloud, David adds. Consider my meditation. It's the unspoken things, the buried burdens, the silent sighs that God also hears. There was a young widow in Jericho who could no longer speak without weeping. Each morning she would sit on her rooftop and simply close her eyes, breathing. Psalm 5 in silence. Her neighbor said, "She never prays aloud, yet she always glows." For sometimes God listens not to our lips, but to the language of our sorrow. David is a king, yet he prays like a servant. My king and my God, he says not, a king, but my king. His authority doesn't exempt him from submission. It increases his need for it. There was once a prince of Moab who renounced his crown and spent the rest of his life copying psalms in a mountain cave. When asked why, he replied, "What is a throne without a king above it?" David would have nodded in agreement. The theme of mourning runs deep through this psalm. In the morning will I direct my prayer and will look up. Morning is when clarity comes. It's when the heart, freshly awakened, is most ready to listen. A fisherman in Capernaum began every workday by whispering Psalm 5 while tying his nets. His boat never missed a catch, and he was known for his peace. Even when the storms rose, morning prayer, he said, is the sail that catches God's wind. David reminds us again that God is holy, so holy that evil cannot dwell with him. This is not exclusion, it is protection. For a holy God to allow wickedness would be like light allowing darkness to remain. It is impossible. A rabbi once taught that God's justice is the proof of his love. He burns away evil, he said, so that righteousness has room to breathe. This psalm breathes that righteousness into the lungs of the weary David. Names the arrogant, the liars, the bloodthirsty, but he does so not with hatred, but with awareness. He is identifying the disease before calling for the remedy. We too must learn to name sin, not to condemn others, but to be honest with our own hearts. A wise elder once told a group of boys, "The psalm does not say they lie, it says liars perish." Don't become what God cannot dwell with. But as for me, this phrase marks the hinge in the psalm. David draws a holy line in the sand. Let others lie, let others boast, but as for me, I will seek God's mercy and come into his house. This is the line every believer must draw at some point. A young woman in Athens once carved that very phrase, but as for Mintu, her front doorpost, it reminds me, she said, that I belong to a different kingdom. David enters with reverence, not casually, not clumsily, but in the fear of the Lord. Reverence is the soul's posture when standing before royalty. In a desert tabernacle, the priests would wash their hands, bow low, and sing Psalm 5 before lighting the incense. We do not serve a small God, they said, but the Holy One of Israel. He asks again for guidance. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness. It is the humble heart that keeps asking. David does not outgrow his need for direction. His crown doesn't blind him to his dependence. He is like a child reaching upward, knowing his father will not mislead him. A blind scribe once described This verse as a rope tied to God's hand, pulling me forward. David turns back to the wicked again, not out of obsession, but vigilance. Their throat is an open grave. He knows the power of words. Words can wound, corrupt, deceive. The tongue, James would later say, is a fire. A merchant in Babylon was known for refusing to speak until midday, so he could first align his tongue with God's truth. He read Psalm 5 each dawn, then watched his words with care. Hold them guilty, O God. It may sound like a curse, but it is actually a cry for justice. The heart that loves what is good must hate what is evil. A girl in exile once refused to join her captors in worshiping idols. Beaten and bruised, she prayed this verse. Let their sins find them out, O Lord, but let their hearts find mercy. Such is the tension of justice and grace. David sees the end of the wicked. They fall by their own counsels. There's a spiritual gravity in God's justice. What is planted will grow. Deception bears destruction. A general once betrayed his people and died by the same blade he had used to silence. Truth, his tombstone, cracked and weathered, bore no name. But in a nearby chapel, Psalm 5 was carved into stone. Let them fall by their own devices. Then the psalm soars again. Let all who trust in you rejoice. Trust is not just refuge, it is celebration. There's a freedom that comes from placing your weight upon the unshakable. In a war-torn village, children danced around a fire singing Psalm 5 while shells rained in the distance. Their joy was not denial, it was defiance. Faith laughs because it knows the end. Spread your protection over them. The word here is cover, like wings, like a tent, like the veil in the temple. It's personal, intimate, and tender. A mother bird does not shield with words, but with presence. There's a quietness to this image that speaks louder than thunder. A missionary in the Amazon once stood between a snake and a child. He said later, God covered me like this verse covers my soul. David says those under God's wing love. His name, not just fear it, love. His name is not cold doctrine, it is warmth, music, identity. In ancient Israel, children were taught to speak God's name with wonder. Yahweh, they'd whisper before bed. Psalm 5 was often their lullaby, a nightly reminder that the Lord sings louder than fear. For you bless the righteous. What is righteousness, if not clinging to God when the world falls apart? Righteousness is not perfection, it is direction. It is turning the face toward heaven, even when the path is full of thorns. A soldier once stitched this verse into his uniform. I may fall, he said, but I fall facing my God. You surround him with favor like a shield. The shield in Hebrew is not just for battle, it is also for honor. Royal shields were decorated with gold, signifying the bearer belonged to someone great. So is God's favor doesn't just protect, it identifies. A poor man in Samaria wore a wooden pendant with this verse etched on it. This is my inheritance, he'd say. Even though he owned nothing else, Psalm 5 is a morning song, yes, but it lasts beyond morning. Its truth walks with the believer through noon's toil, evening's questions, and night's shadows. It is an anthem, a map, and a resting place. A church in Egypt recites it at every major gathering, believing it clears the spiritual air and calls angels to attention. David's prayer, wrapped in reverence, trust, justice, and joy, teaches us more than theology. It teaches us posture, the posture of humility, the posture of one who rises early, not to perform, but to listen, one who believes God is not only near, but attentive. May we, like David, learn to begin our days with holy expectancy and end them with covered hearts. And so Psalm 5 continues, not just in Scripture, but in the mouths of saints across centuries, whispered in prison cells, sung in sanctuaries, memorized in trenches, and clutched by trembling hands. It is not merely David's psalm, it is ours. May we carry it, live it, and rise with it again and again, until every prayer becomes praise. Psalm 5 is not a cry into the void. It is a conversation with a living God. David does not speak as one who doubts if he is heard. He speaks as one who knows heaven leans close. Give ear to my words, he says, like a child tugging the robe of a loving father. In a remote Syrian village, a shepherd boy once sang this psalm aloud into the wind every dawn. His friends mocked him, saying no one was listening. But years later, during a drought, rain fell only on his fields. Someone was listening, he said with a smile. David doesn't just pray, he orders his prayer. He sets it in place like a priest setting the bread of the presence. In the morning, I will direct my prayer unto thee. It is not random. It is structured, offered with intention. A faithful woman in Galilee once used pebbles to count the verses of Psalm 5 as she whispered each one before her children awoke. Every morning, she laid them like stones before God, a quiet altar that no man ever saw. Looking up is not a mere gesture, is a declaration. When David says, I will look up, he is refusing to be defined by the horizon. He refuses to be bowed by the weight of what surrounds him. In the catacombs of Rome, early believers carved eyes into the stone walls next to this verse. Eyes, wide, lifted not, in fear, but in focus. To look up is to remember who reigns, they taught. For you are not a God who delights in wickedness. What a line. This is not only a judgment against evil, it is a revelation of God's character. His holiness is not cold and distant, it is the blazing fire that makes him trustworthy. A judge in ancient Jerusalem refused to accept bribes, even when threatened with death. When asked why, he quoted Psalm 5-4 and said, If God takes no pleasure in wickedness, neither will I. David is not merely angry with the wicked, he is heartbroken. He knows what deception does to souls, how pride poisons the air. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. The wicked may rise in the eyes of men, but they cannot stand in the sight of God. A wealthy merchant once lost everything through fraud. At his lowest, he clutched Psalm 5 and wept. I boasted before men. Now I kneel before the one who sees all. But as for me, how often the righteous must draw this line. David does not gloat. He humbles himself. He knows he enters, not by merit, but by mercy. A refugee, sleeping on temple steps, once whispered this verse every night. I have no key, but mercy opens doors, he'd say, and somehow, every morning, he had bread and warmth from strangers. David's reverence is not rigid, religion it is relational. In fear of you, I will worship toward your holy temple. This fear is not dread, it is deep respect. A silversmith once described it like this: fear of God is what keeps the hand steady and the metal pure. So too, fear of God keeps the heart honest and the soul pure in worship. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness. Here is the cry of every heart that wants to walk straight in a crooked world. David does not ask to be led in his own strength or in the ways of men, but in God's righteousness. In a valley outside Bethlehem, a father carved this verse into his son's walking staff. You will lose your way, he said, but his righteousness will lead you home. David sees that the wicked do not stumble by accident, they are swallowed by their own mouths. Their throat is an open tomb. Words can bury the speaker. A scribe once said, every lie is a shovel of dirt over the truth. And so David pleads for deliverance from words that smell of death. Even when dressed in charm, God is a God of justice. David does not flinch from this truth, he leans into it. Hold them guilty, O God. He does not call for wrath out of personal spite, but because righteousness cannot ignore rebellion. A woman who watched her village burn at the hands of thieves once read this verse with tears. Not for revenge, but for redemption. Let them fall, she prayed, but let them rise to you in repentance. Let them fall by their own counsels. Wickedness always implodes, eventually. Like Haman hanging on his own gallows, or Judas destroyed by the weight of his betrayal, evil is often its own executioner. A young believer who once trusted a false teacher said this verse became her shield. His counsel nearly destroyed me, she said, but God pulled me out before I fell. To David turns again to the righteous, not as those who are better, but as those who believe. Let all those that put their trust in you rejoice. Trust and joy are eternally linked. Even when sorrow sits beside you, trust makes room for joy to dance. A grandmother in exile taught her grandchildren to sing this verse before every meal, no matter how small. Where there is trust, she'd say, there will always be enough. Spread your protection over them, covering like wings, soft and strong. God's protection is not always escape, it is often endurance. A man facing execution for his faith once stood tall and quoted this line aloud. His final words were not defiance, but peace. He covers me. David desires more than safety. He desires singing. Let those that love your name be joyful in you. Joy in God is not a side effect of blessing. It is the source of strength. A group of children in hiding during wartime sang Psalm 5 from memory in their shelter. Bombs fell, but they sang louder. Our voices reach heaven, they said, because His name holds us. For you, O Lord, will bless the righteous. Blessing here is not material, it is spiritual identity, divine approval, covenant nearness. A man who lost everything in a fire stood in the ruins of his home, reading this verse aloud. He smiled through the smoke. I am still blessed, he said. The fire could not touch his favor. Not behind, not in front, all around. It is complete coverage. A Roman soldier once carried a small parchment of Psalm 5 beneath his armor. He told his fellow soldiers, this shield is stronger than steel. He survived a brutal campaign and credited not his sword, but the words on his chest. Psalm 5 reminds us that prayer is not passive, is warfare. David rises early, not just to speak, but to engage. The psalm is a sword, a song, a strategy. A missionary in hostile territory once said, this psalm is my war cry. I wake up swinging it. And each day, she walked boldly into danger, under God's covering. The righteous are not perfect, they are persistent. Psalm 5 is not sung by flawless men, but by forgiven ones, by those who run toward mercy and walk in fear. A recovering thief once said, I recite Psalm 5 every morning because I still remember my old ways. I need to hear that mercy welcomes me again. David's final word is shield, and what a word. Not a wall to hide behind, but a mark of belonging. The shield of God is not only defense, it is identity. It says, this one is mine. And so the psalm ends, not in despair, but in declaration that the righteous, covered and joyful, will walk through darkness with their eyes lifted high, still singing,